interest in writing, this seemed like a perfect way to try to bridge the sciences, the arts, and the humanities, something that's a little bit more integrated than the typical silos we can get caught in sometimes. And this is just wonderful. I don't know what else to say at the end of this semester.
I think students from all the campuses should know, Dr. Merlewski has had a full career as a conservation ecologist, and then went and got an MFA, I think, in poetry, right? And that's just, you're never done learning and educating yoitself and sharpening your tools. Craig, would you mind just sharing briefly a little bit about Paul Smith College, where you are? I think it'd be, because that's a place where students on this call could go maybe do a semester, take a summer course in the spirit of RSC.
Yes, they actually could. And we're working more and more towards collaborations as well with other institutions. Being a small college, about 650 students in the Northern Adirondacks. We're about a 5-hour drive north of New York City and about an hour drive from Montreal. So we're not very far from the Canadian border at all. Within the Adirondack Park, which is a 6 million acre park, it's about owned half by private citizens and half by the state agency. And so it's kind of an interesting patchwork, and a lot of people describe it as a social ecological experiment. We're part of the Lake Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Reserve. So it's internationally recognized as a biosphere reserve. In the Adirondacks, we're the only 4-year college in the Adirondacks. It's a very unique place, I guess you could say. And I hope that what we're doing this semester and other things we're doing with RSC, that this is something that we can build upon. Actually, it's work. It takes effort, and there's challenges, but it always seems very, very worthwhile.
Yeah, and good timing with the common theme of healing. Thank you for that. And for those of my students who've enjoyed that, you have, Craig to thank. And then Mike Bryson, Dr. Bryson, I mentioned your urban nature writing class. You're at Roosevelt University and in Chicago. You want to talk just a bit about that and how your class is connecting with this project before we introduce Tom?
Sure, thanks, John. And thank you, Laura and Craig, for taking me on in this collaboration. I was the latecomer to the trio, and but really happy to participate here from the southern rim of Lake Michigan. Chicago is one of the urban representatives, perhaps the most urban in the RSC. And my students this semester are in a first-year general education course called Humans in Nature, which is an Ideas for Social Justice seminar that we teach in our sustainability program. So, and their majors are all over the map. So I'm excited for them to engage in this writing project and connect with people, with fellow students across the country in their letter writing, and really curious to see how it's all going to end, or if it ends. Hopefully it'll keep going. I just want to also briefly thank students and colleagues from a neighboring institution, Joliet Junior College, which is significant because it's not only in the Chicago region, it's actually located in my hometown of Joliet, Illinois, where I am currently broadcasting from. And significantly, JJC is the oldest community college in the United States. It was founded in 1900. Well, they can correct me. I was going to say 1903. It might be 1901. So it's a pretty, and we've got some people doing good work on sustainability and resilience here in Joliet. So thank you to my colleagues from JJC for being here.
That's wonderful. Welcome, JJC. It's an honor to have you. And then Laura, I'd love to hear from you briefly as our master's level representative in the conversation. I know you live in Fort Collins, but you direct our program here at Western.
I sure do, because everyone should stay in school and go on for their Master of Fine Arts, which is a terminal degree. And there's only a few in the nation that are dedicated to nature writing. So I think we're on the cutting edge, and our focus is really on contemporary writers, what they're doing now, how they're engaging with policy, social justice, environmental justice, boots on the ground work. And I'm so proud of our program and the students in our program. It's new-ish. We have our first graduating cohort this summer, and I'm so proud of them. And it's growing and expanding, and we welcome applicants, of course, always looking for good writers to speak up for the natural world.
And how did you take on this assignment, Laura?
Oh, sorry. Was that the question? The correspondence, I just believe in the power of handwritten word. In many of my classes, we read Ted Kuzer's poetry that he corresponded with Jim Harrison, who wrote Legends of the Fall, for those of you who don't know. And just this long tradition of writing to one another and the bigger ideas that can come out of that. And not just how are you and how's the weather and emails that get lost forever, but something tangible and real that shows up in the mail with a stamp. And I think there's been varying levels of involvement, but I think it's all been very interesting and good.
Excellent. And for my part, the students in the classroom that you all see there, that is the honors intro to environment and sustainability course, similar to yours, Mike, kind of a gen ed course on humans and nature. The way they're taking on this healing theme is they've been reading Tom's book. They actually finished it for today, Tom, with the Kimmer essay and a couple others. They've each been matched one-on-one with a different graduate project, either MS Ecology Research Project or a Master in Environmental Management hands-on, like wilderness management project, or working in making sustainable materials out of a junkyard project. They each have a specific project, and their job is to choose the top 5 readings for them from Tom's book and that experience of healing the land, and talk about how the relationship between healing land and becoming whole as human beings. And so we don't know, my students, to what extent, you'll get to see the work from these other classes or share yours. But I'm very open to creative ideas and open to giving extra credit to those who want to share. I'll just mention, when you look at this network and think about, being in Adirondack Park for a semester, being on the south side of Chicago, anybody in the RSC, there's 2 spots a year for RSC graduate to go get a free master's in global change management at our partner in Germany, right? There's some cool stuff that goes along with it. And this is just one small conversation that comes out of it. So with all that said, let's make the network work for us a bit. And Tom, what I really love about you, and I want to say in this intro, is you're redefining something old school, and that is natural history. And I love that. And, for students who think that's just sort of, kind of going out of an environmental education center when you were in 5th grade with the class, and you learned about some flora and fauna, Tom brings that's important, and not but Tom brings it to another level as you're learning from his book. And so he came to the Headwaters Conference a couple of years ago. So some of you who were here then might remember that. Some of you might recognize Mike Bryson from the Eden Place documentary I showed you, by the way. Mike's been to Headwaters as well. But you mostly know him from the book you read. But I think the work he does out of Arizona on natural history is incredibly important. And so, Tom, we're so grateful to have you here, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, John, and everyone. So I don't forget, let me get my screen up here. Let's see here. Okay, everybody see that okay? So thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's great to hear about your consortium. I guess I first wanted to say it's just a real pleasure and honor to be speaking with you all, I guess, from 4 colleges and universities. And also, I love hearing about the consortium. And I taught actually at Prescott College in Arizona for 3 decades. And in the last few years of that, I was involved in helping start a consortium between 6 colleges, which is called the Eco League, So I have a good sense of both the joys and also the challenges and frustrations that can come from trying to do this kind of collaborative work across institutional boundaries, time zones, et cetera, et cetera. So my hat is off to you all for that good work. So that said, here, I'm just going to close a window here so I'm not staring at myself. So I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm going to try to do. I understood the range, the great range of interests and focuses of the different classes, and that's great. That's music to my ears. Really, I'm a sort of interdisciplinarian by both inclination and training to a large extent. In fact, one of you used almost the exact words that is the tagline of the Natural History Institute, which I direct, which is integrating art, science, and humanities. So that's really what my work in the world is about these days. So that said, I'm going to really be talking about, I'm going to try to weave a number of things together and hopefully leave enough time for questions and comments if there's time for that. And so, as John mentioned, natural history is a term that we're sort of trying to reclaim. And I suspect for many of you, if somebody just walked up to you and asked you what that meant, it would conjure up images of visits to dusty dioramas in museums when you're in a grade school field trip or something of the sort. But it really means more. And I'm going to try to explore that quite a bit here with you. But knowing that there's interest in the book itself, and also that the one class is a creative writing class. So I thought what I would do is sort of begin and end with brief readings from the book, and then in between sort of fill in some of the sort of focus more on the content of the idea. So that said, I'm going to read first an excerpt from the prologue to the book, which is just called Entry. This book unabashedly declares that love for our biologically and culturally diverse world is a fundamental virtue and imperative. Humans are born to practice natural history, simply put, to pay attention to nature, and are physically, emotionally, and socially healthier when we do. Collectively, the contributors explore this notion that attentiveness to nature remains an essential pathway to sanity and health for both individuals and societies. Ecologists, psychologists, and educators, poets, novelists, and artists, researchers and creators, theorists and practitioners, the healers and the healed ask, how can nature heal us as individuals and communities? How does practicing natural history lead to healthier lives? And why does deep engagement with nature help us love the world? From different nations, cultures, professions, religious traditions, and approaches to engaging the world, these writers explore how natural history, a practice of intentional, focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy, is at its core the practice of falling in love with the world. When we pay attention, we connect. When we connect, we become more whole. That's with a W. The words whole and heal derive from the same Old English and Proto-Germanic roots. For at least 700 years, our language has recognized that wholeness and healing sprout from the same source. So, natural history, a practice that leads us toward wholeness and healing as we make our way within this world shot through with wildness, that ineffable wisp of life force, the sinew that braids us together. Nature, love, medicine, healing ourselves and the world. So, sort of introduces a number of topics, another few ideas that I want to explore in a little greater depth. I've taken more and more in recent years to being explicit about this idea of the importance of loving the world, and that natural history is a practice of falling in love with the world. But what is natural history in a more perhaps traditional or historical sense? The term natural history, which can be confusing, is literally is about 2,000 years old, and was first in Latin Historia Naturalis by Pliny the Elder, right around the time of Christ, and which was actually a set of the first encyclopedia, the first attempt anybody ever made to put down in writing everything that humans knew about the world. Some of it is still in print today, and some of it seems quite prescient, some of it seems comical. But one of the reasons the term can be confusing is that historia in Latin, as in contemporary Spanish, has two meanings. One is history in the way we think of that, but the other is story. So literally translated, natural history means the story of nature. But of course, nature doesn't have a single story. And so in any time and place, there is an infinite number of stories we can focus on, choose to pay attention to, etc. And that is both overwhelming and wonderful and a great gift. There's been many definitions, attempts to define natural history in recent years. These are of just a sample of a few from the last, say, 30 years or so, 20, 30 years. These are all by biologists. And so I think all of these definitions have great merit, but they're all sort of narrower than the way I think of this, because they're all focused just on biological sciences. Barry Lopez wasn't trying to define natural history exactly, but he was describing natural history in his wonderful National Book Award winning book, Arctic Dreams. He referred to the patient interrogation of a landscape. And I think that's a really neat idea, that there's a conversation. Interrogation is maybe a little bit hostile sounding, but a conversation with landscape. So I already referred to this definition. If you're taking notes, this is the right answer, in terms of what is natural history, mine. So this is, first put this out in the world 20 years ago, and a practice of intentional and focused attentiveness and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. And just kind of what I'm getting at there is that there's a paying attention, and there's also being receptive to what's offered. And more than human implies that it's not a dichotomy between humans and the rest of the world. It is not ignoring humans. And guided by honesty and accuracy is the idea that we're not trying to project our idea of what we think nature is onto the world. We're trying to be honest and accurate about what we see. Charles Darwin actually said accuracy is the soul of natural history. So if you're to boil that down to its basic idea, natural history, you could say, is simply the practice of paying attention. And I want to emphasize that idea of practice, or as I sometimes say, that natural history is a verb, not a noun. We tend to think, especially because of the museum connotations, we often think that natural history is just a bunch of facts lying in a drawer. And I'm not at all denigrating the importance of all those facts, but I think what's really exciting and important about the idea is this idea of a verb, that it is a practice, it is a doing, and of paying attention. And that doing can happen in a lot of different ways. Like my friend Lisa here, who is a botanist, identifying a flower, actually not too far from where you guys are in Colorado, with a technical plant key. Or it can be someone out just through a more artistic lens, awestruck in a tropical forest, or any infinite number of examples we could give. Excuse me. So one of the ideas here is that we're all wired to practice natural history. And by that, I mean, I'm speaking as an evolutionary biologist here. The evolution of our species was all about creating our capacity and fostering our capacity to pay attention to the world around us. That's why our eyes are where they are, where our ears are where they are, et cetera, et cetera. And it helps us. And our survival has always depended on this. Our ability, for example, to distinguish between predator and prey, to know when food plants were available, when animals we might want to hunt would be passing through our valley, et cetera, et cetera. That is all natural history and what we've evolved to do. And this manifests in in all peoples in all sorts of different ways, in all sorts of different cultural backgrounds, etc. Okay, so the history of natural history, you might say, I already mentioned Pliny the Elder, coined the term Historia Naturalis, and just after the birth of Christ. But you could also take that further back. Aristotle, for example, 4 centuries earlier, was really, a lot of his work was really focusing on what I would call natural history now, observing a sort of observational science about the world, how the world was put together. And you can go back further than that, and I would suggest that all hunter-gatherer cultures everywhere were really an essential part of this tradition of natural history. And I would actually change that slide and say not only 10,000 to 100,000 years ago, but right up to the present day. So another way of saying that is natural history is the oldest continuous human endeavor. There has, in other words, never been people in the world without the practice of natural history. This idea, without the practice of attentiveness to the world around us, it's fundamental to who we are as biological beings. But there has never been a time in the history of our species when such a small percentage of our species actually practiced this attentiveness, practice this natural history. And that to me is right at the nub of why we're at the place where we are in the world, why we need healing so desperately. And I think that it is not coincidental that at the very time when natural history is practiced less than ever before, that we have these just epidemics of antisocial behavior, of gun violence, of depression, of anxiety, and you name it, and you can make your own list. But those things, in my mind, it's not a coincidental alignment there. So why does natural history matter? Well, I'm sort of already alluding to some of it, and seeing the children hiking through a forest together also leads to some speculations on why it's so important. But let's look at that a little bit more. So one thing that the psychological literature tells us is that people's actions are motivated more by what we feel than by what we know. In other words, by feelings more than facts. So what allows us, what prompts us to feel affinity for the world? Well, and what kind of feelings? So this idea, I think that loving the world is actually motivates us more than being frightened for the world, which is another thing we can talk about later if you'd like to follow that thread. But natural history is the way we engage directly with the world and in a way that allows us to feel. And I'll cycle back to that numerous times. So why does natural history matter? Well, I have here environment in quotes. The word environment is part of the problem in my mind for environmentalists. And I taught in an environmental studies program for 29 years. So I'm very, really have thought a lot about this and think about this. But environment literally means essentially the root word essentially means surroundings. So it's almost inherently a sort of detached, impersonal kind of thing. So, but natural history, I would say, is part of the solution. So natural history, the attending to the world around us, is what reanimates the world, is what puts the life back in the world. And so we connect with individual organisms. We see the dolphin leaping out of the water, or whatever the example might be, as opposed to just this abstract environment, which it's hard to feel a lot for sometimes. So, whoops. So also, I'm sure that many of you are deeply familiar with Aldo Leopold's work and his probably most famous essay, The Land Ethic. And there you see in those 2 sentences, essentially is his land ethic. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. I've always loved the clarity of that. That's what an ethic is. This is right and this is wrong. He goes on, though, in that essay to say this: we can be ethical only in relation to something we can see, feel, understand, love, or otherwise have faith in. So what I'm suggesting is that it's natural history, this practice of attentiveness to real organisms and real places in the world, is what gives us this kind of seeing and feeling and understanding that motivates us and that promotes this kind of moral behavior, you might say, in a way that environment in the abstract can never do. For a bunch of years, I have been sort of paying attention to how natural history changes us as people. For many years, every spring I taught a sort of double course, field course called Natural History and Ecology of the Southwest. And on the last day of the semester, I started asking students, just how do you feel, if at all, do you feel different from the way you did on day one of this course? And I started taking notes on that. And so that's what I'm now calling social field marks of natural history. And these are some of them here. And I want to just explore a few of those. So humility, something in way too short a supply, certainly in our political world these days, is fostered pretty dramatically when one is practicing natural history and, for example, sees tracks like this on the gravel bar in the river where you're passing a canoe. These are grizzly tracks. Or in one of the most phenomenal moments of my life, being 20 miles offshore in a boat that was about 20 foot long, and then having this animal come right up next to us, and then it's a long story that I could go on for a long time, but for about 4 hours, we were surrounded by orcas and completely vulnerable. One of them was as big as the boat, and yet it ended up sort of transmuting into this moment of communion with them. Or humility, very easy to have when one encounters, as my friend Harry here did, a snake that is, 30 feet long, et cetera, et cetera. But it isn't just big, scary animals. It's things like just the stillness of canyons and the sense of time that comes in a place like this, or the unexpected sound of a whale blowing in an inlet. Or this is something I encountered in the Southern Ocean, a very rare chunk of ice. This blue color is from when something has been compressed under a glacier for so long that it compresses all of the air bubbles out, so it's this blue. And so you see that and you know that this chunk of frozen water has just been re-emerging into the air for the first time in millennia. All these things make us feel humble. Natural history inspires us, which literally, of course, means we breathe it in. Natural history engenders joy. I started paying attention to how often my friends I was in the field with all had sort of wrinkle marks on their face from smiling and laughing so much, especially at the end of a day in the field. And Lord knows we need more joy in our lives. It fosters an expanded sense of self, what some would call an ecological sense of self, so that the I is inclusive of other parts of life. And that ties into the sense of compassion, which of course literally means feeling with. And the more we can feel with our fellow travelers on this planet, then the more likely we are to act with proper stewardship. And it fosters hope because it reminds us repeatedly of the endless beauty of the world and the fascinating aspects of the world. And it, in some cases specifically can provide examples for sustainability practices, such as how does a desert plant adapt to drought, might give us an idea of how to construct a building, so on and so forth. But really, to get to the main idea that's drawn all you together in this semester is the idea that natural history heals. And this is something we've been playing with more and more recently. And that healing is reciprocal. About a year and a half ago, actually just not too long before the pandemic hit, my Natural History Institute convened we called it a national confluence on reciprocal healing, which was trying to bring together the streams of medicine, psychology, and natural history. And so I just want to look at a little bit of the evidence that that natural history does indeed heal. So when I started work actually on this book initially, and then on the conference, I started dipping my toes into the professional literature of psychology and of medicine and so on. And I started to be blown away by how much was coming out in those literatures and how rapidly it was actually incredibly challenging to keep up with the flow of literature and papers coming out. And these are just some of the things, and I'll highlight a couple of these that were demonstrated in the peer-reviewed literature about what they don't use the term natural history in these kind of studies, but they're really talking about what we're talking about here, sort of immersion in nature, paying attention to our surroundings. So let's look at just a few of these. So one was this. This is from a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, arguably the most prestigious scientific journal in the U.S. And what they noticed is that immersion in nature reduced brooding, which they referred to, I love this term, morbid rumination. So there was less morbid rumination for those who walked in nature. They would dwell less on negative aspects of their lives. And also, if you look at that second point, that even there's actual sort of physiological changes in terms, in this case, how the blood flow changes its pathways when one spends more time in nature. And in many of these, there was that sort of thing where there was more, not only sort of things that might be dismissed as being sort of touchy-feely or just sort of generalized qualitative descriptions, but actually a lot of measurable physiological changes taking place. Lots of stuff on the reduction of depression and anxiety. These are just a few of the papers that point that out, but there's lots of stuff on this. This was an interesting one that this one paper suggested that what they called kinder behaviors, and they were specifically talking about generosity and trust between people and groups, was promoted by immersion in nature. So you start adding all this up, and what it's telling us is that by being immersed in nature, or I would say practicing natural history, we become healthier, we become better people. Also really interesting stuff about the effect on our immune systems. So in this case, even they were looking at measurable differences at the cellular level, including release of anti-cancer proteins. So it's again, as the more I dug into this stuff, the more kind of amazed. It all was sort of intuitively correct, but I had no idea at the degree of research that was really documenting a lot of this. This was a very interesting study. They did this in Toronto, actually, a team group, and they compared different neighborhoods. Excuse me, about the cardio and sort of physiological health of people in different neighborhoods in Toronto, and compared them based on how many trees were in the series of blocks that they were looking at. And as you can see there, neighborhoods that had 11 more trees, were healthier in a way that was analogous in other ways that we would predict by being $20,000 a year richer or a year and a half younger. So I mean, if the American advertising industry could figure out a way to make money on this, we would all be doing natural history and living in their neighborhoods with more trees. Another one, that our creativity and problem-solving capacity increased. This was a study that was done where people went along on an Outward Bound program, actually, and did tests sort of before and after kind of thing, and saw dramatic improvement. And on and on. This was a big study, a big sort of summary paper that came out just not even 2 years ago. From a very international, you can see the authors there, they're from all over the world, actually, and they tried to summarize a lot of this literature that I've been talking about, and they came up with a couple consensus statements, basically that there's no question that there's association with psychological well-being, and that the evidence supports basically reduces the risk factors for certain types of mental illness. So it's pretty strong and overwhelming evidence for those who like the empirical evidence. So we can talk about more of that as we go along if you like. But I thought I would come back and read another excerpt from the book, a slightly longer one, and then I'll end there, and then we'll see what we want to talk about. Okay, and I'm not quite sure how much time we have. So what I read you from before was from just a little prologue to the book, and so I also wrote a chapter in the book. I guess some of you know that, which is the first chapter called "Our Deepest Affinity." And I'm going to read from a couple. I'm going to jump around and read from little excerpts from two different parts of that chapter in Our Deepest Affinity. The crimson bird perches, almost motionless, on the stout horizontal branch of the velvet ash, 20 feet above my head. Every few seconds, its substantial bill opens slightly as it chirps loudly. For almost 10 minutes, I quietly watch and listen to this repetitive behavior. The only other sound and motion, wind tousling these oasis trees, ruffling the surface of the deep green pool beneath the abruptly rising russet limestone cliffs. My daughter, soothed by the day, just finished with a year of college, dozes peacefully on the sand a few feet behind me. It's no accident that she and I are here together in this moment, able to witness this summer tanager, far northern outlier of a group of wonderfully colorful tropical birds, seemingly out of place in North America's desert Southwest. It had been a hard week. Stresses at work that swallowed days, created unexpected meetings, and traced shadowy outlines of loss in the lives of friends. Losses of jobs and identities. And in one especially tragic case, the loss of life, when a colleague riding his bike home from work through the desert was abruptly smashed to the pavement and sudden death by a drunk driver. All this, convening coworkers, responding to somber concerns, explaining decisions and actions, kept me tethered to a computer screen, the flat face of illusion and anonymity. On my way home from a culminating, especially draining meeting, bruised by the challenges and sorrows within my community, I realized my spirit needed rejuvenation. I needed beauty. So I proposed to my daughter, a healing balm in her own right, that we hike together into one of my favorite canyons the following day. We drive through the parched tan landscapes of upland Arizona in June, the edgy time of year when subtropical moisture amasses into towering clouds, but monsoon rains, that for which generations of rain dances were danced, taunt us with their non-appearance. We crossed the crest of Mingus Mountain, passing through cool pine forest, then descend into the heat of the valley on the steep downside of this fault block mountain. We swish and sway down the curves of the two-lane road, finally turn off and cross the Green River, true to its name, Verde, and then veer onto 10 miles of bumpy dirt. We scramble out at the trailhead and descend quickly toward the lush beauty of a spring-fed wilderness canyon. From one moment to the next, as we arrive at the canyon bottom, we leave behind the heat and the dust and are enveloped by deep shade and the shifting burble of moving water. In we walk, enfolded within shimmering green, with red cliffs at the perimeter of vision, bolstered by the promise of watery escape. This new world is rich with birdsong and tantalizing flicks of yellow, red, and blue amongst the fluttering leaves. Whenever we feel like it, we stop and sit quietly at the edge of this stream, rushing with this great arid land's miracle, abundant, clear water in motion. Like the stream, our conversations meander, new job, new relationship, upcoming travels. Like the smooth sandstone ledge we sit upon, our minds begin to still. What I never doubted, nor even had to consider, that coming here would heal us, that the cradling embrace of this biodiverse canyon would be good medicine. Now, skipping ahead several pages. It's the final night of a week-long group backpack into red earth. After a late supper and lingering conversation, two of us lay back, stunned into horizontality by the night sky. In this canyon of smooth stone, deep in the heart of one of the largest roadless areas in North America, our eyes gaze intently where they rarely focus, upward. The dome of stars is phenomenally textured, with vast depth visible within the Milky Way. Swirls and eddies of pulsating light contrast with the velvet black of infinity. Arcing downward, the gaudiest shooting star I've ever seen blazes brilliantly for a full 20 seconds as it angles toward Earth. Its long tail remains gleaming even after I close my eyes. It's a brief interlude of extended psyche as our minds momentarily stretch beyond their usual boundaries, a sense of delighted union with the larger forces of not only this world of green, but the universe that surrounds it, and better, for sharing it with a close friend. Lying face up to the heavens, dazzled, humbled, entranced by the endless array of light, provokes a fundamental feeling of kinship with people through times and cultures. We all look up and wonder. And on these sandstone slabs in front of this long inhabited alcove near 1,000-year-old petroglyphs and discarded clay pots, we see the same framing of the universe as our ancestors, unchanged through human time, but for the occasional steady scoot of a tiny satellite's light. In these singular moments, we are the outbreath of galaxies. Thank you.
Wow, Tom, I think I'm going to sit with Outbreath of Galaxies of my life. Let's all unmute, please, everybody. Tom, that was beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Outbreath of Galaxies. Can we just sit with that?
I'll leave this slide up for just a minute in case anybody wants any of that information, and then I'll put it up so we can see more of it.
Well, and while people are thinking of questions, I just love, and Annie Dillard does this really well, how you go from the micro, the bird song, right, all the way out to the galaxy, and by connecting those two, you connect us all, because we're all in between that spectrum. Beautifully done, and you got me thinking more about recovery than healing, because I think sometimes we can make the assumption that, like, okay, I went in the canyon, now I'm good, all my trauma is healed, and we were talking the other day about how we have to be careful, like it's not the time to go off the meds just because you've gone on a hike, you know. But
right.
I think the way you talk about it as a verb,
from where?
Natural history as a verb really keeps us from that magic wand view of nature and healing. Let's open it up for some questions. If you're not asking a question, go ahead and mute your screen, everyone.
I'll stop the share so we can see more faces.
Yeah, and somebody's unmuted.
If I can find something I can do remote part-time, maybe, like.
I think it's David Graves.
If you guys look at your sites, thank you.
Don, I think you can mute him, David Graves.
Okay, let's open it up. David Graves, why don't you go ahead and mute while I figure out how to mute people. And then let's open it up. Thank you so much, Tom.
Absolutely. Thank you. And
Did
by the
you-
way, I'm not sure of the time frame or whatever, so I'll let you just be the timekeeper.
Yeah, great. And did you want to say anything there between the difference between like nature and recovery as a verb versus healed from being in nature?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. If we think of healing as the idea of becoming whole, then in a way, recovery, of which I'm not an expert about, but in the sort of psychological sense, is I think sort of making ourselves partially whole, or it's like a step in that direction. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I hadn't actually really thought about it quite in those terms before.
Thank you. Well, let's open it up.
While everybody's thinking, I'll ask a question. We love this book and we talk about it in every class. And the question always comes up, like, why do books like this? Are you preaching to the choir? And I always quote Kathleen Dean Moore and say, yeah, preach to the choir is listening. And they might have people on the outside who are not yet in the choir, but could be invited to join. And then this whole conversation gets going. But it is a good question. What would you say to aspiring writers or scientists about the importance of what they do next? Because I guess one of my belief systems is like, no one else is doing it. Like, you've got to jump in and do it. But could you add to that or disagree with that?
Sure. Those are interesting questions. And well, thank you for the kind comment about the book. And well, I think Kathleen's comment is a good one. I might advertise. She and we're doing a program through Natural History Institute where she and I will be having an on-screen conversation on June 3rd. So maybe somebody will be talking about some of this kind of stuff. You might be interested in. Some of you might be interested in that. But I think so. There's a number of ways I might respond. One is that it's useful. First of all, I think if you're motivated to write something and tell a story, it's worth it for its own sake. And if something happens and it connects with somebody, that's great. But I don't think that everything we create has to be for a particular goal. Because oftentimes we put things out there and they connect in unexpected ways with people. And so I think there's something to be said just for getting it out there because we feel it and we want to articulate it and we feel better. But also Kathy's point about the choir, all of us in the choir need encouragement and need reinforcement. And I think that's kind of what she's getting at there. And there's this Buddhist notion of Sangha, or like sort of community of practice. And so I think, I feel like, we're probably all part of that same community of practice, and whatever we can be done to sort of keep gearing ourselves back up for the work ahead is incredibly important. But that said, this book, it's the second anthology I edited. The first one a few years earlier was called The Way of Natural History, and might be interested in that as well. But after I did that one, I started thinking about natural history, and I started thinking about, okay, how specifically really about your question, like how does this extend out into people who might not otherwise be wanting to think about natural history? And our own health was what came to me. And that's actually how I got into this project, was specifically trying to go beyond just the choir, but to make this relevant to all sorts of other people. So all along I've been feeling that basically the practice of natural history does what a whole lot of other fields aspire to do. We feel better. It's all this different stuff. And so that we trying to get that word out there. And so, yeah, but those are good questions. Those are the first things that come to mind. I guess
go ahead, Craig. Craig had a question, and then there's two in the chat. I'll bring up here in a second.
Okay, great. Yeah, Craig.
Yeah, first of all, thanks. This was extraordinary in terms of some of the things that I've been talking with students and trying to figure out and asking them their ideas and thoughts, because I get stuck in my own mind a lot of times. And Two things jump out or are kind of questions or things that I think about sometimes. And the first one, John brought up the idea of recovery. And of course, we're talking about healing. And it seems like I just had to think about that for a second. And it seems like healing is a part of recovery. And what is it that we're exactly trying to recover? I talk about this with students. We have an ecological restoration program here. And it's like, are we restoring these landscapes, these natural environments for ourselves, or are we restoring ourselves to these environments? And there are two different ways to think about it. And I don't have any answers there other than that's where I often leave it with myself as well. But the big thing, I had this conversation with students earlier in the day too. We have environmental science, we have environmental studies, we have environmental management. Pick your environmental program, academic program, or whatnot. How do we take this natural history and integrate it not just as a course or a couple of courses? How do we integrate that into an academic program in such a way that it comes out as being something meaningful, something that is seriously tied to art and the humanities and not just a scientific endeavor? And it's just a question that's out there. I'll leave it at that. And thanks for reading. I just loved your readings there, just the experience and the reflection. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, those are good questions, Craig. You asked several things. So as far as the academia piece and how to solve that is it's actually very interesting to me, is that because it actually natural history used to be pre-World War II was seen as a fundamental part of education in higher education in the US. In a lot of the US, there was a wonderful book that some of you I'm sure are familiar with by Anna Comstock out of Cornell, which is a handbook of nature study, it was called, which and that was a standard part of teacher training in the United States before World War II. So it's not like we're trying to create something that's never happened before. But of course, there's all sorts of reasons why within the academy that things have worked against that, and especially since World War II with the development of molecular biology and the space race and all sorts of stuff. There's been like a lot of drift towards certain kinds of very you might say, and I don't actually mean this in a derogatory way completely, but partially, reductionist sciences, where we're looking at, or as Aldo Leopold, one of my favorite Aldo Leopold quotes is that he says, people are learning more and more about less and less until someday we'll know absolutely everything about nothing at all. And which, by the way, was in his writing back in the late 20s or early 30s. It was his lament even back then about the loss of natural history education. So he called it Natural History, the Forgotten Science. So, and a big part of it also, I think, is academic reward systems. And I've been part of groups of people who have been trying to look at that. But so as long as young professors get jobs and then they can't advance without getting credit for doing certain kinds of natural history sorts of work, then that is a challenge. It's also, I think, quite simply, in many big research institutions, it has to do with what kind of money can be brought in for different kinds of sciences, especially. So it's a much too common occurrence that at big universities, over time, people who do field biology and natural history are edged out and they're replaced by molecular biology labs, analytical chemistry labs or what have you, because, I mean, there's good reasons for some of that, but there's also an administrative push for some of that kind of thing, because the grants that universities like to take a huge cut out of any grant, and you get a lot more money to build. It takes a lot more money to build a molecular biolab than to buy a pair of binoculars. And so there's I think it's been an administrative push as well. So those are hard things to fight back against. So we kind of all started, and I think smaller colleges and institutions like the ones that all of us here are involved with, as really, in my mind, where the real change happens, and where kind of we lead from the edges, you might say, rather than from some of those big universities, although there are some that are doing great stuff. But like there's many examples. Like, for example, I live in Arizona. When I first moved here 30 some years ago, the University of Arizona in Tucson had a wonderful tradition of lots of great naturalists, had been there for a long time, a lot of mapping of the plant geography of the state, et cetera, et cetera. And one by one, when each of those people retired, they were almost none of them were replaced by other field people. But your point also gets to, it shouldn't just be for the sciences. And I think that natural history, in this expansive way that I'm referring to it, really should be at the core of any kind of learning endeavor. And it's kind of like the basis of all human inquiry into the world. And so that's my quixotic quest, is to kind of try to push for that.
Well, and thank you for mentioning our campuses, because it's really part of the vision of the consortium. It's just these smaller campuses, when united together, you still get the intimate experience of professors knowing their strengths and areas of improvement, right? But across 12 campuses, you get all the options of a big university.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And we have actually on Sunday, hang on a second. On Sunday, we have from our German partner, Ebbsweiler University, an undergrad there, coming to spend the whole summer into fall here with us, and we'll be hanging out as a research assistant. But
That's great.
History like research,
Yeah.
And there are
great.
questions in here. I'm going to connect two. One's from Josh and one's from Erica, and they're related. They say, this one's Josh. How can natural history help us address social injustices? Is the common ground from which we overcome inequality of the planet we're killing? And then Erica maybe offers the beginning of a solution to that by asking about structured public land efforts to open more natural spaces for any community, specifically underserved communities. What do you think about the equity of access to nature today? So, the role of natural history in generating intersectional environmentalism, equity, taking on social injustice.
Yeah. Great questions. Well, natural history can't solve those problems all by itself, of course, any more than any other single thing can. But what I would say is that natural history is the birthright and the inborn evolutionary capacity of every person, regardless of culture or circumstances. And so issues of equity and access, those are hugely important. And I think natural history per se can't solve those, but understanding and articulating the benefits of the practice of natural history to all people helps create the case for in another way for why that's so important. And that said, and especially to our Chicagoans here, that in urban settings, it's a very different situation. But and a lot of my photos and stuff are from big wild places, but that doesn't mean that you have to be in those places to practice natural history. So, some of the most famous bird watching places in the United States are in the middle of New York City or Boston or whatnot. And there's things to check out and look at in almost anywhere we are. And some of the most accomplished naturalists I've ever encountered in my life are people, as I once wrote, that are living very close to the bone and very, what an economist might consider, depauperate circumstances, and yet their lives are very rich because in other ways, because of their connection to the world. So So I think those are really, really important questions and things to be thinking about. And I think that the practice of natural history and a recognition of its importance is part of the toolkit, you might say, of making the case for that. But in and of itself, it can't solve those things. And so, but absolutely, there's no question that there's big issues of equity of access, and I'm happy to see that being more and more addressed.
Well,
Recently.
it looks like your comment, access to nature's a birthright, really spoke to folks. And I wanted to just pause for a second. Alex had a question I wanted to pose, and then David had one, but just I wanted to pause to see if anybody from another campus wanted to kind of add to what Tom had to say about the importance of access to nature, the importance of, what did you call it? Natural history is the process of falling in love with the world, right? So say, when you say access to nature is a birthright, falling in love with the world is a birthright, is what you're really saying, right?
Right.
That practice that goes, that's both scientific, artistic, etc. Does anybody want to add to that? Just that relationship between natural history and its potential for social justice before we move on. Okay, Alex had a question. And Alex, I might ask you to follow up just to make sure I understood it right. This question was about the relationship between natural history and climate change, and I'm sure Alex isn't asking about whether climate change global warming has an effect on nature itself, but he asked if it had an effect on natural history.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that natural history has had a lot of effect on the recognition of climate change, because a lot of the best evidence about climate change has actually come from, in many cases, amateur naturalists who have been just keeping field notes and records for a long time. So, for example, there's an amateur naturalist in Tucson who had walked the same trail every day for it was 15 or 20 years, keeping track of flowering times, and suddenly. And he was just doing it for himself, and then all of a sudden somebody got wind of this, and it was like this incredible data set of changes in phenology or the timing of biological activity, which was great evidence about climate change. So, but the question was actually asked the other way around, and I'm not sure if I actually understand if climate change affecting natural history, we're certainly are witnessing. You might think of natural history as just the practice of bearing witness to the world around us, and we're witnessing very different things because of climate change. Just this morning I was in a conversation with some colleagues about here in the Four Corners area, junipers of all things, which are really drought adapted trees, there's rapid changes and diminishment of their populations. This was especially in southeastern Utah, but also people noticing it here in northern Arizona. That's a natural history observation that has huge relevance to climate change, but also climate change. So climate change is influencing what we witness through the practice of natural history, but there might be a part of the question I'm not quite understanding.
Yeah, Alex, did you want to add anything to that? Or is he kind of answering your question there? I think especially with phenology, it's an incredible impact on natural history from climate change, especially.
Yeah. So phenology, if for those who may not be familiar, is essentially the timing of biological activity. So when does the leaves come out on a plant? When do the flowers come out? When do the fruits set? And there's actually an organization, the National Phenology Network, that helps try to tie together a lot of observations about this. And so that is actually some of the most grounded, and I mean that literally, like on the ground evidence of climate change from not just North America, but around the world. And that a lot of that comes from amateur natural historians.
Well, and prior to, climate change, being part of the natural sciences in the 40s and 30s, many of you know Aldo Leopold would get up, 3:30 in the morning and start listening to that first bird song. And
Right.
The Leopold Foundation, everyone in Wisconsin still uses that as a basis for, has there been significant change over decades?
Yeah.
Real geeky point that hurts the heart. One of his sons wrote about why his dad was really getting up that time of day. And it wasn't because of his love of birds. He couldn't sleep after the atomic bomb or after it was developed. And that's when he really was like, I guess I'll really commit myself to being out there. So there's another kind of social and environmental connection. Kind of like simple but really nice question. David asks, what got you interested in natural history? Like, where does that come from, Tom?
Well, it's interesting actually. I like I would say, well, I would assert that every human in the world is, like I've said, everybody's born to do natural history, and that might sound like an audacious claim, but I would just, my evidence is, check out any toddler in the world, regardless of what country they live in, what culture they're from, watch what they do. It's innate in us to start turning over stones, smelling things, looking at things, and then we've had to be culturally trained out of thinking that that's important. So I was like that, and one thing that was important in my own path and my own family was starting when I was not quite 4 years old. My family started going on camping trips to national parks around the country. This was starting in the late 50s when that was not a very common thing. And I kind of fell in love with landscapes. And I also was inherently really interested in birds as a little kid, drawing pictures of them and all that kind of thing. And then, like far too many people, it stopped seeming cool, because I had no mentors and I had no friends that were into it. And so basically I kind of stopped paying attention to any of this stuff for at least 10 years. And then I was fortunate when I was in college that I connected with some people who were really getting to it, kind of reawakened all of it to me. And then I kind of went crazy. So, and then also realized that it's really, it's so accessible, to be, you don't necessarily need fancy degrees or this or that to get joy and connection to the world through just paying attention. So
I think this is our final question, and I'm excited to read this one because it's from one of the students writing this, like, you're doing this project to heal land, how's it affecting your wholeness essay. It says, we've related nature and wildness to healing, recovery, and even called it medicine. This medicine brings us closer to being whole, but is being whole truly attainable? I think that's a great question. Is nature similar to a painkiller in that we only need to take it when in pain, right? Or is nature more of a prescribed medicine and required in long-term treatments to be effectively therapeutic? What a very, I would say, vital and important question, because folks could be misled by some of these studies, like I said earlier, and get off their meds at the wrong time or whatever. So I love that analogy. What do you think about that, Tom?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I'm using the term medicine, I might say not in the like AMA kind of way, as like something you go get a prescription for, although there actually is more and more stuff. In fact, there's one of the essays in this book is about, probing that idea of what's the right prescription of nature. But but more in perhaps the way that a lot of indigenous peoples have used the term medicine in a more broad kind of way, that it's basically, this is good for making this one with the world. And but I think it's actually really, there's a number of important things implicit in that question. And one is that if we look at this in an overly sort of utilitarian or self-centered way, like, oh, we should care about nature because it's going to cure my problems, there's a danger in that it becomes a commodity. And yet that has to be balanced with some of what we were talking about earlier about, I think it was Laura's question about how do we reach out beyond the people that already know and understand all this, and what's good for us as individual people is one of the ways we do that. So there's a kind of inherent tension there. But I think, but as far as my use of the word medicine, it's really in the broadest kind of sense possible.
Great. And I think we'll close there. I would say, Tom, it's kind of apt that in this conversation about, pain and deep whole healing, while you were answering these questions, Derek Chauvin was convicted of all counts of murdering George Floyd.
I just heard my phone ding and I figured
Yeah.
that was what it was, but I didn't know what the answer was. So that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so let's all think about how this conversation intersects with solidarity with George Floyd's family and community, and the kind of deep healing we all have work to do. And let's all let Tom hear our gratitude. This was wonderful and so timely. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. And keep
Thanks,
up the good
Tom.
work.
Great.
All right. And
Okay.
Craig and Mike and Laura, thank you for enlivening RSC during a crazy pandemic here. I'm so grateful, and let's keep it up. Let's keep doing it. And students, let us know if you want to read each other's work. It's just such a rare, cool thing that this is happening. And so just reach out. We'll make it happen.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tom. Take it
Take
easy.
care.
See you,
Bye,
John.
everyone.
See you, Laura.
And thanks, Brianna. Thanks, EMVS 100. Go get out in this beautiful weather.